How's it going, everybody? I'm Dave Glavin, an aspiring NBA salary cap strategist. And today I'll be discussing how the Indiana Pacers can operate this offseason ahead of what is, in my opinion, the most interesting offseason in the NBA following their big swing at the trade deadline to acquire Ivica Zubac. Following Miles Turner's departure in free agency last summer, the Pacers had a clear void at the 5 spot in their starting lineup and took a committee approach to the position in the first half of this season. Offseason acquisition Jay Huff has been able to replicate some of what made Turner such a great fit with the team, stretching the floor offensively and protecting the rim on the other end. However, it seems like he's best suited as a bench contributor. Isaiah Jackson, Tony Bradley, James Wiseman, and Micah Potter all had chances in that spot this season, but ultimately Indiana chose to pursue a more proven product in the trade market, and they paid a premium for Zubac. They used the expanded trade exception to bring in him and Kobe Brown, sending out Benedict Mathurin, Isaiah Jackson, a conditional first rounder this season, an unprotected 2029 first round pick, and the Mavericks 2028 second round pick. Zubac has a small trade bonus that was applied and spread over the 3 remaining seasons on his deal. Indiana's first round pick this season has some pretty unique protections, 1 through 4 and 10 through 30. So the Clippers get it if it lands 5 through 9. Otherwise, it conveys as a 2031 unprotected first rounder. At the time of the trade, Indiana had the 3rd worst record in the league at 13-38, making this move a rare gamble for a team with such high odds of a top selection, especially in what's projected to be a very strong draft. I listened back to Kevin Pritchard's offseason press conference, and he made it pretty clear that they were willing to take a risk if the right opportunity arose. But I don't think anyone really expected this type of risk. There's very few players who impact the game like Turner with his ability to stretch the floor at the center position. But while there are definitely questions about Zubac's fit in an offense that wants to run, I really think he's going to elevate their defense in a way that Turner wasn't able to. Chad Buchanan said post-trade that he felt like there's 4 guys in the top tier of the draft, and they're willing to give up the opportunity of picking 5 through 9 for a guy like Zubac. Mathurin was never really a great fit in Rick Carlisle's system, and trading him now was their last opportunity to do so before his restricted free agency this summer. The Clippers will retain his bird rights and the ability to match any offer he gets on the open market. Isaiah Jackson was in the first year of his 3-year, $21 million deal, and he was expendable, with Jay Huff providing rotation big production at a third of Jackson's average annual value. I'm going to start by discussing the financial and roster building impact of keeping versus conveying their pick this summer. The main differences are essentially how much of the mid-level exception they can use, which affects which apron they'd be hard capped to, and how many tradable first-round picks that they would have. It's important to note, in Pritchard's media session last summer, he also said that they were willing to spend into the tax to retain Miles Turner and would have treated the second apron as their de facto hard cap, as opposed to what has been the luxury tax for 20-plus seasons. I believe this Zubac trade indicates that same belief in the potential of this roster, but time will tell if that translates to what would be their biggest single-season financial commitment in decades. And I think this is the most important factor in all of these projections. If they keep the pick, which is projected to be number 2 right now, they'd be about $7.5 million above the tax, $500,000 below the first apron, and roughly $13 million in space below the second apron. Given their proximity to the first apron, while they would have access to the non-tax and biennial exception, they wouldn't be able to use either effectively. They could use the full tax mid-level, which projects to be about $6 million, assuming a 7% growth in the cap. And that would hard cap them to the second apron. They'd be about $7 million below, with no avenue to increase their payroll outside of re-signing their own free agents or adding minimum salaried players. After the draft, they'd have 2 tradable first-round picks in 2027 and 2033, and 7 second-round picks. On the flip side, if they convey the pick this offseason, they'd enter the offseason about $5.7 million below the tax, with about $14 million in space below the first apron and $26.5 million below the second apron. They'd have a bit more flexibility to use both the non-tax and biennial exception if they wanted to, as well as an additional tradable first in 2031. Keeping versus conveying their pick doesn't change their 3-year outlook all that much. As you can see, they have a majority of their current roster signed through 2027, 2028, with no significant negative contracts, which is always good. And I'd like to address this situation now before getting into the specific paths that they're going to take this summer. Their top 5 highest paid players, Tyrese Halliburton, Pascal Siakam, Ivica Zubac, Andrew Nembhard, and Obi Toppin, all become extension eligible this offseason. And Indiana will have until October 19th to negotiate with them, as they all have at least another year remaining with no options. Halliburton's the only guy that has 2 years left. Additionally, Jarris Walker and Ben Shepherd are going to become eligible for rookie scale extensions starting on July 1st. Indiana will have till that same day, which I expect to be October 19th, to extend those two. I'm not going to go fully in depth on those negotiations just because I believe this video is more focused on how they can approach the overall roster construction this summer. And while extensions certainly factor into that, I think they deserve an entire video on their own to really dive deep into both the player and team perspectives. My personal philosophy is that extensions done before a player's final contractual season are reserved mainly for all NBA players. I just think there's too much risk involved, especially with how quickly situations can change. Regardless of how I feel, though, given that he's going to have 2 additional years remaining and is coming off an Achilles tear, I don't envision an agreement for Halliburton this summer. Same with Obi Toppin, who's coming off an injury as well and has 1 additional year left. Despite Andrew Nembhard's encouraging statistical improvements this season, especially his turnover percentage decreasing while his usage rate has increased, I think that's encouraging. They're not paying him to be their starting point guard. And I think they're going to need to see another season of him next to Halliburton, specifically to see how well he complements him defensively before extending him. Zubac is the most likely to get an extension offer, just given what they gave up to bring him in. He's eligible for a 3-year, $99 million deal, which would put his average annual value at roughly 15% of the cap, assuming 10% growth year over year after next season. I think it would be fair value for him given the recent center deals that we've seen. Jared Allen got about 17% on his new extension, Jakob Poeltl about 16%, and Miles Turner just got 16% this past offseason. As Yossi Goslin pointed out in his recent analysis of the trade, a 3-year extension for Zubac would have him on Indiana's roster through 2031, which is when they would convey that last first to the Clippers if they kept their own this season. I encourage everyone to check out his Substack. It's the best salary cap analysis on the internet by far. Despite another all-star season, I don't expect an extension for Pascal Siakam, given that his current contract runs through his age 34 season. While he's been incredibly durable over the course of his career, this situation is an example of what I was just talking about. Unless he wants to lock in more long-term guaranteed money on a team-friendly deal, what's the risk in waiting another year, just seeing how he ages? I think another factor in his negotiation, more so than the others, is if they convey their pick or not this season. Adding DeBansta, Boozer, or Wilson to this team wouldn't change how they feel about Siakam in the short term, but it would absolutely affect their willingness to commit to another long-term extension. Lastly, I don't expect Walker or Shepherd to get rookie scale extensions, barring significant developments over the rest of this season. While Walker in particular has been playing better over the last 2 months, I don't think either guy is a playoff rotation piece for them right now. And given their existing financial commitments, one or both of them could be moved to provide more flexibility to add someone who can contribute right away. In terms of their direction, assuming that Tyrese returns to pre-injury form or very close to it, Indiana is built to contend for a championship, and they should be operating that way this summer. After acquiring Zubac, their starting 5 is solidified and one of the most well-balanced skill-wise in the league. Off the bench, I think there's a pretty high confidence in Toppin, McConnell, and Jay Huff as legitimate playoff rotation pieces. Their 4 young guys, Jarris Walker, Ben Shepherd, Johnny Furphy, and Cam Jones, really haven't shown enough to warrant that consideration yet, and Indiana doesn't have a ton of time to wait on their development. I think their 2 biggest rotation needs heading into the offseason are bench scoring with the departure of Mathurin, as well as ball handling depth, just with Halliburton's injury and TJ McConnell getting up there in age. I'm going to project 4 main pathways for Indiana this offseason based on 2 main factors: pick conveyance and financial ceiling. The first route that I'll discuss has them keeping their first round pick while continuing the trend of ducking the luxury tax. Where that pick lands within the top 4 will have significant financial and roster building implications because of the change in projected rookie skill amount, as well as with who could be available for them to select, which I'll illustrate by showing both extremes, the first overall pick and the 4th. Depending who they have at the top of their board, there has to be a conversation about trading back in the top 4 to acquire more assets. They'd be the first team since the 2017 Celtics to do so, but I think that has to be an option if they land at the top. Regardless, assuming they wanted to keep their projected rotation intact, their margin for error to duck the tax would be extremely thin if they landed the number 1 pick. Jarris Walker and Ben Shepherd would almost certainly be on the way out, not only because of their combined $13 million salary, but because their bench roles would likely be diminished with the addition of a top 4 selection. Given what the Celtics just accomplished with their financial gymnastics, it's not absolutely necessary to move both those guys in the offseason, although their value may be higher then. I'm going to highlight what trading them at the deadline would look like. Indiana could re-sign Micah Potter on the vet minimum and head into the season about $11.5 million above the tax and $3.5 million above the first apron, with access to the full tax mid-level, which projects to be about $6 million. If they move both on deadline day and took back no salary, they'd sit about $1.9 million below the tax. However, they'd essentially have about $1.4 million in room when taking into account Obi Toppin's $480,000 unlikely to be earned bonus. They'd have to have protection to make sure that they could still be below the tax if he earns that. They'd have a few avenues to fill out the roster and satisfy the 14-man requirement, but one option that I've illustrated here is to take the full 2 weeks that they're allowed to consecutively be below 14 roster players, sign a vet minimum and a 10-day contract, and when that 10-day deal expires, take the remaining 2 weeks of their below 14 time, which they have 28 days over the whole season, and then they could sign another vet minimum, which would leave about $160,000 in space, even if Toppin earns his bonus. Alternatively, getting the 4th pick would give them a little bit more flexibility if the direction was still to duck the tax. They wouldn't necessarily have to move both Walker and Shepherd. In this example, they could re-sign Micah Potter and head into the season about $7.5 million above the tax. I have them moving Walker and Cam Jones on deadline day and signing 2 vet minimums the day after to fill out their roster, and they would have more than enough space below the tax, even if Toppin got his bonus. Their ideal pathway is to keep the pick and treat the second apron as their hard cap, which again is what Kevin Pritchard said they were prepared to do last summer to retain Miles Turner. I see no reason why this attitude shouldn't be the same now after the Zubac trade. Using the cap hold of where their pick currently stands, which is number 2, they'd be able to use the full tax mid-level as well as re-sign a guy like Micah Potter to an inflated average annual value, such as a 2-year, $10 million deal with a team option on year 2. I think he's a minimum level player, but this structure would give them more flexibility to add a full non-tax mid-level salary in a trade, as they would still be able to aggregate salaries under the second apron. They just couldn't take back more money than they sent out. Potential tax mid-level candidates that could fit in Indiana are Chris Middleton, Bogdan Bogdanovic, assuming that the Clippers decline his team option, and Josh Okogie. On the flip side, if they convey the pick and need to deduct the tax, the path is pretty simple. They could re-sign 2 of their own free agents like Micah Potter and Ethan Thompson on vet minimums, and they'd have plenty of space below the tax, even if Toppin earns his bonus. If they convey the pick and are given the green light to spend, past the tax that is, I think the first apron would be a more realistic hard cap based on the roster building tools that they have at their disposal and the caliber of their own free agents, unless they like heavily inflated Micah Potter's year one salary in a new deal, which I think might be acceptable if he's a minimum guy and you give him $5 million, but I don't think it's acceptable if he's a minimum guy and you give him 15. In this example, I think they could move Jabari Walker, which could give them the ability to use the full non-tax mid-level and part of the biennial exception, while adding Potter on the vet minimum to fill out their roster. Potential full non-tax mid-level candidates this summer that could fit in Indiana are Quentin Grimes, John Collins, and Colin Sexton. It's important to note that they could keep either of these exceptions available for the trade deadline, as they could function as trade exceptions as opposed to the tax mid-level, which cannot. But any use of above the tax mid-level, so above that projected $6 million amount, would hard cap them to the first apron, as well as if they use the biennial exception. Appreciate anybody who tuned in. Again, I think Indiana has one of the most interesting off seasons coming up, outside of maybe OKC. But if they are able to add a top 4 pick to this roster, they can absolutely contend for a championship. Thanks again. Going to be back with another video soon.